The property sat beyond the last maintained road, where municipal boundaries softened and responsibility became unclear. Trees grew close to one another here, not in forest density but in the slow, unmanaged way of land that no longer expected attention. Seasonal changes passed without record. Leaves accumulated. Rooflines darkened. Paint faded evenly, without vandalism or urgency. There was no marker to indicate that a dwelling existed behind the overgrowth. From the road, nothing suggested habitation, past or present. The structure was not abandoned in the dramatic sense. It had not been evacuated. It had simply been excluded. Maps showed the area as undeveloped. Records listed it as empty. Silence defined the place more than isolation. No wind chimes. No fencing. No signage. Wildlife passed through without adjustment. Weather acted on the building without interruption. Time moved evenly, without notice. For decades, the house remained outside of daily awareness. It was not hidden intentionally. It was overlooked through process. Through paperwork. Through assumption. In regions like this, ownership does not always align with visibility. What is not taxed regularly can vanish from administrative memory. What is not inherited clearly can become unclaimed without intent. This landscape did not signal discovery. It waited. Unaltered. Undisturbed. It existed in the pause left behind when something once accounted for was no longer followed. She had lived most of her adult life inside a framework that was stable, if not remarkable. 40 years of marriage created patterns that rarely required examination. Financial responsibilities were divided by habit rather than design. Documents accumulated gradually. Accounts were shared. Decisions were deferred. Nothing about the arrangement suggested risk. They married in the early 1970s, at a time when household structures were still largely conventional. He handled property matters. She managed domestic continuity. The division was informal but complete. Over decades, it became permanent by repetition. They moved several times during the marriage, following work opportunities that never required permanence. Rentals replaced ownership. Storage replaced archives. Important papers were filed, then refiled, then eventually misplaced without consequence. There was always tomorrow to retrieve them. She worked intermittently, often close to home. Employment supplemented income but did not establish independence. Benefits accrued in his name. Legal correspondence was addressed to him. Utility accounts followed the same pattern. When illness entered the household, it arrived slowly. The shift from shared routine to caretaking did not occur suddenly. Responsibilities increased, but authority did not. Medical decisions were discussed. Financial ones were postponed. After his death, the absence was administrative before it was emotional. Accounts were frozen. Access was questioned. Letters arrived that she could not answer. Others stopped arriving entirely. The will was incomplete. Certain properties were referenced without detail. Others were omitted entirely. Titles were missing. Deeds could not be located. Records suggested assets that no longer appeared to exist. Without documentation, possession reverted to process. Banks required proof. Agencies required verification. She had neither. What had been shared became conditional. What had been assumed became unavailable. The life they built did not disappear all at once. It was removed piece by piece, through forms she could not complete and requirements she could not meet. The point at which her situation changed was not dramatic. There was no single meeting or ruling that stripped her of stability. Instead, it occurred through sequence. Each step followed the last, without pause, until reversal was no longer possible. The first notice arrived from a financial institution requesting updated authorization. Her signature was insufficient. The account had been established before digital records were standardized. Original documentation was required. She could not produce it. Next came property inquiries. A parcel referenced in older correspondence was flagged during a routine review. Tax payments had ceased years earlier, redirected automatically from an account that no longer existed. The land was listed as inactive. No enforcement followed, but no recognition remained. Attempts to clarify ownership exposed the gap. County offices searched by name, then by address. Nothing appeared. The marriage certificate confirmed spousal status but did not establish property rights. Without a deed, the structure did not formally belong to her. At each stage, the response was procedural. No one denied her claim outright. They simply asked for confirmation she could not provide. Time limits passed quietly. Deadlines expired without notification. Eventually, access narrowed. Housing assistance required proof of displacement. She had no official address to lose. Benefits required assets to be declared. She could not verify what existed. What could not be documented could not be counted. The system did not accuse her of deception. It treated her as absent. Her status shifted from participant to exception. By the time she understood the scope of the loss, the options for recovery were administrative rather than personal. Appeals required resources. Legal counsel required funding. Both assumed stability she no longer possessed. The moment of no return was not the death of her husband. It was the accumulation of unanswered forms that followed. The absence became fixed not through intent, but through elapsed time. They moved several times during the marriage, following work opportunities that never required permanence. Rentals replaced ownership. Storage replaced archives. Important papers were filed, then refiled, then eventually misplaced without consequence. There was always tomorrow to retrieve them. She worked intermittently, often close to home. Employment supplemented income but did not establish independence. Benefits accrued in his name. Legal correspondence was addressed to him. Utility accounts followed the same pattern. When illness entered the household, it arrived slowly. The shift from shared routine to caretaking did not occur suddenly. Responsibilities increased, but authority did not. Medical decisions were discussed. Financial ones were postponed. After his death, the absence was administrative before it was emotional. Accounts were frozen. Access was questioned. Letters arrived that she could not answer. Others stopped arriving entirely. The will was incomplete. Certain properties were referenced without detail. Others were omitted entirely. Titles were missing. Deeds could not be located. Records suggested assets that no longer appeared to exist. Without documentation, possession reverted to process. Banks required proof. Agencies required verification. She had neither. What had been shared became conditional. What had been assumed became unavailable. The life they built did not disappear all at once. It was removed piece by piece, through forms she could not complete and requirements she could not meet. Daily life narrowed after the administrative closures became permanent. Without access to accounts or recognized assets, she adjusted to a condition that resembled displacement without movement. She remained in the same region, but without a fixed address or registered residence. Temporary arrangements extended, then expired. Each solution depended on tolerance rather than entitlement. She began by staying with acquaintances from earlier periods of her life. These were not close relationships. They were former neighbors, distant relatives by marriage, people who remembered her presence but not her needs. Stays were brief and negotiated carefully. She contributed where possible. She avoided permanence. Personal belongings were reduced to what could be transported in a single vehicle. Items accumulated over decades were divided quickly. Some were stored. Others were given away. Documentation was prioritized, though its usefulness was uncertain. Boxes of papers were reorganized repeatedly, each time producing the same absence. Her days followed a controlled pattern. She woke early to avoid imposing on shared spaces. Meals were minimal and scheduled around others' routines. She spent time in public libraries, municipal offices, and transit terminals. These spaces required no justification. Information became a form of labor. She learned how to search county databases, how to interpret property indices, how to read archival maps. The process was slow. Older records were not digitized consistently. Some existed only in bound volumes. Others had been transferred between jurisdictions. The property that would later define her survival appeared first as a reference in a ledger. The description was incomplete. No street address. A parcel number with annotations that no longer matched current zoning. The land had been purchased decades earlier, before municipal expansion. There was no indication that a structure remained. Tax assessments listed the land as unimproved. Satellite imagery was inconclusive due to canopy coverage. Aerial surveys from earlier decades were incomplete. She returned to the records repeatedly, cross-referencing dates. The name on the purchase matched her husband's. The timing aligned with a period when he had worked temporarily in the area. She had not accompanied him. The property had never been discussed. Accessing the site required physical effort. The location lay beyond public transport routes. She borrowed a vehicle for the first visit. The road narrowed, then ended. Foot access continued through unmanaged land. The house was not visible at first. It emerged gradually, through breaks in vegetation and changes in ground level. The structure was intact but deteriorated. Windows were intact. The roof showed signs of age but not collapse. There was no evidence of recent habitation. No utilities. No mail. The interior contained minimal furnishings, consistent with seasonal or temporary use. Dust covered surfaces evenly. Rodents had accessed storage areas. She did not occupy the house immediately. Legal status was uncertain. Squatting laws varied. Ownership was unverified. She returned to the site multiple times, documenting condition and location. Over weeks, she established a routine that included the property. She cleared access paths. She secured entrances without altering the structure. She transported supplies gradually. Each visit extended. Eventually, the distinction between temporary presence and residence dissolved. She slept there intermittently, then consistently. Heat was managed through portable equipment. Water was transported manually. There was no sense of reclamation. The house did not resolve her status. It provided shelter without recognition. She lived without utilities, without address confirmation, without title. Survival became procedural. She maintained the structure minimally. She avoided detection that might prompt eviction. She continued legal inquiries, now with physical evidence but still without documentation. Time passed without resolution. Seasons changed. The house remained. Her presence did not alter its status. It existed, as she did, outside formal acknowledgement. The limits of the arrangement became apparent gradually. Living without formal recognition imposed constraints that accumulated rather than announced themselves. Each solution carried a cost measured in effort, exposure, or uncertainty. Winter imposed the first sustained pressure. Without permanent heat, temperature dictated routine. She slept in layers. Movement became a method of warmth. Fuel was rationed carefully. Nights shortened activity. Days were planned around daylight. Food access depended on distance and timing. Without refrigeration, perishables were avoided. Meals repeated. Nutritional variety narrowed. Weight loss occurred without intention. Medical care was postponed unless necessary. Appointments required addresses she could not provide. Isolation increased as the location limited contact. Visitors were rare. Communication relied on public access points. Messages were brief. Explanations were reduced. She did not describe the situation fully. Doing so risked intervention without resolution. Legal progress slowed. Evidence of occupancy did not establish ownership. Inquiries reopened old files but produced no transfer. Records confirmed that the property had not been claimed, but also that it had not been released. It remained in a state of administrative suspension. Physical fatigue accumulated. Tasks that had once been manageable became prolonged. Carrying water. Clearing debris. Maintaining weather resistance. Each required recovery time. Psychological strain appeared not as panic, but as compression. Decisions were narrowed to immediate needs. Long-term planning became abstract. Time blurred into maintenance cycles. There were moments when leaving seemed necessary. Each coincided with a lack of alternative. Returning remained the only option. Loss occurred without ceremony. Stored items degraded. Equipment failed. Paper records were damaged by moisture. Some documents became unreadable. Others were lost entirely. The delay was not intentional. It was structural. Resolution depended on processes that did not prioritize individual cases without advocacy. Advocacy required stability. She remained. Not through endurance, but through continuity. The house persisted. So did she. Resolution arrived without announcement. It did not come through discovery or confrontation. It came through reclassification. During a routine county-wide review of dormant parcels, the land was flagged again, this time for consolidation rather than inquiry. Changes in zoning authority had transferred oversight to a different administrative body. Older records were re-indexed. Marginal notes were re-entered. What had once been an incomplete reference became a traceable asset. The name on the original purchase resurfaced with greater clarity. Cross-linked employment records confirmed presence in the region at the time of acquisition. The absence of subsequent transactions was no longer treated as uncertainty but as continuity. A site inspection followed. It documented the structure as existing, habitable in limited condition, and continuously occupied. The report did not assess intent. It recorded facts. Notification was issued to the last recorded next of kin. It arrived as a single letter, without emphasis. The language was neutral. It requested confirmation rather than proof. The documentation she could provide was still incomplete. What had changed was the framework evaluating it. Occupancy, duration, and maintenance were now considered evidence rather than liability. The transfer was not immediate. It followed standard waiting periods. Notices were posted. No objections were filed. When confirmation arrived, it was concise. Ownership was acknowledged. Utilities could be applied for. The address could be registered. There was no visible change to the house. No renovation followed. The structure remained as it had been. What changed was its status. She continued to live there without ceremony. The house did not symbolize recovery. It represented continuity, something that had existed all along, now recognized. The record of her survival does not appear in emergency reports or rescue timelines. It exists instead across administrative margins, property ledgers, and delayed acknowledgments. There was no moment when she was officially lost, and no moment when she was formally found. What she endured was not wilderness in the conventional sense. It was institutional absence. A form of isolation produced not by geography, but by omission. The house was never unknown. It was simply unattended by process. Cases like hers appear periodically in housing and legal archives. Widows without documentation. Properties purchased privately, maintained minimally, and forgotten through generational transitions. Structures that remain intact while their owners vanish from records. Survival, in this context, was not marked by ingenuity or resistance. It was defined by persistence within constraint. She did not overcome the system. She remained present until the system adjusted. The house did not save her. It did not restore what was lost. It provided shelter long enough for recognition to catch up. When ownership was finally acknowledged, nothing else changed immediately. Daily routines remained modest. The structure aged at the same pace. The environment continued without regard. What endured was not the discovery, but the continuity. A life lived quietly through delay. A structure existing without acknowledgement. Both remained until alignment occurred. There was no conclusion beyond that. The records closed. The house stayed occupied. The silence lifted only enough to register presence.